Welcome to Episode 9 of How Positive Are You?, a weekly podcast offering news and views from the other side of AIDS. This is Christine Maggiore, author of the book, What If Everything You Thought You Knew About AIDS Was Wrong?
And I'm David Crow, president of Rethinking AIDS, an international organization of doctors, scientists, journalists, educators, and legal experts who question the role of HIV in AIDS causation.
On today's program, we discuss Retro, a recent episode of the primetime TV show Law & Order Special Victims Unit, in which a false version of my life is used to send a supposedly true message to viewers about AIDS. Our special guests include Robin Scovill, my real-life husband of 12 years, whose inexplicable HIV-negative status causes him to be eliminated from fictionalized portrayals of our family, as well as from most factual news articles. Also joining the show is Dr. Jocelyn D., an AIDS specialist who consulted with Law & Order writers during the development of the story concept. But before we get to that and our special guest, David, you have some news items.
Yeah, from Haiti, AIDS doctors are enrolling voodoo priests. While some of these priests claim that AIDS is an old disease that they've been familiar with for a long time and that they have herbal treatments, there's a new program to redirect them, quote, through workshops, A Positiva, a Haitian AIDS organization, trains voodoo priests to identify the symptoms of HIV infection and encourage patients to go to a clinic for testing and treatment. Possibly they're using the same definition in Haiti as they use in Africa, where malnutrition, essentially, fever, cough, diarrhea, and weight loss are taken as the symptoms of AIDS, and no HIV test is necessary. I think the moral of this story is that voodoo is okay as long as they leave AIDS to the men in white coats. Can you imagine the fuss if the voodoo priests persisted in claiming that some kind of non-toxic intervention, perhaps even better food and clean water, could help people with AIDS?
That's a big challenge, too, in Haiti. It's one of the poorest countries in the world, and good food and clean water are at a terrible scarcity. So the idea that you can look at someone who's thin, malnourished, and ill and decide based on the training these voodoo priests are going to get that they're a potential candidate for testing and treatment, that's a pretty scary thought, especially given that, as I always mention, the tests don't test for the virus itself or any specific or unique markers that have ever been validated by the direct purification of HIV, but also the poorer the people are, the more exposure to microbes, parasites, amoebas, things that can cause positive results on these tests with no, quote, HIV necessary.
Dr. Matt Irwin, who's from the Washington, D.C. area, refers to what he calls the voodoo hex. He's referring to the HIV diagnosis itself as voodoo science that convinces the person who receives it that they're doomed. So I think that's an interesting irony.
Voodoo meets voodoo.
Voodoo means voodoo. A second item, this is not really a news item, but I received an email that said, "Hello, my name is Katya. I am from Russia. I'm 27 years old." Now, you can imagine what I thought. I've seen lots of emails like this, and then they go on to say that they want to marry some rich guy from America. But this was different. My diagnosis is HIV positive since I'm 21 years old. My shock and fear have gone a long time ago, so I think my opinion is now objective. I've read a lot of literature on the internet, and I think that science has no proof of the virus's existence, and also tests based only on antibodies cannot be correct, at least. This is only a small part of what I know, and the smallest part of what is known in this theory. And she apologizes for her English. She obviously had to struggle to write this message. But I think we're reaching people around the world with this information, and the information is leaking out all over the place.
That's interesting, David, because I sent out a couple of books and films on order this week to Russia, to St. Petersburg specifically.
Well, this may be somebody who's hooked up with some of the Russian rethinkers. I have one more news item. Getting back to Africa, sadly, here's a review paper in the journal AIDS that states early mortality rates in sub-Saharan Africa are very high. Between 8 and 26% of patients die in the first year of antiretroviral treatment, with most deaths occurring in the first few months. Although data are limited, leading causes of death appear to be tuberculosis, acute sepsis, cryptococcal meningitis, malignancy, and wasting syndrome.
Wow.
So that's a pretty amazing admission in a major AIDS journal. Of course, they try to twist it to say that people are waiting too long to get treatment. They're already coming in really ill. There's nothing we can do to help them. They never consider the possibility that they're actually actively killing people by giving them these drugs.
I always considered that an interesting argument, that the drugs work best if you take them when you're not sick.
Yes, it is interesting. It almost gets to the point where if you've shown any signs of illness, well, they're not going to work. Maybe that would be good. They could say, well, you've got a cough, so the drugs don't work if you've got a cough, so it's too late.
But it's interesting because most of the time you take drugs because you're sick, not because somebody predicts or imagines or supposes that you'll be sick. And by prescribing these drugs more and more to people who aren't sick and then saying, well, look how long they live now, it's I don't know, the fact that they're being given to people who aren't sick and that people who aren't sick don't get sick right away is a claim that the drugs are working. And then at the same time, if you are sick and you take the drugs and remain sick or die, they say it's because you didn't start when you weren't sick. I mean, does that seem to be a bit of a logistical conundrum there, or is it just me?
I was hoping that you weren't going to ask me to explain the logic, because I think it's a little bit distorted. And only because dissent is not allowed can they get away with this kind of thing. I think in a lot of other areas people would say, wake up, the drugs are killing people. But of course, since everybody who writes for the journal AIDS is a true believer, then nobody's going to have the temerity to say something so radical. And if you do say something so radical, obviously you don't belong in the pages of journals like AIDS or...
Yeah, it just seems to me the argument, the drugs work best when you don't need them and don't work when you do is odd.
Yes.
But that's just me, so
yes,
what do I know?
I think it is. It's also very sad, a death rate of 26% in the context of what the establishment says about AIDS, which is that the time from HIV infection to AIDS is 10 years. That's extraordinarily high. And
I remember that back several years ago there was a diet pill combination called Fen-Phen.
Oh, yes.
Oh, and I think there were a handful of deaths, and mostly women. And people started developing heart arrhythmias and problems with their cardiovascular system.
Actually, Christine, the combination knocked out the valves of the heart, which was fatal. After a very short time.
Very short time, not many people. That was just boom, gone from the market. And it surprises me how, in this particular situation and scenario, drugs that are shown to cause significant adverse events to such a degree that I was looking over an older paper that claimed, this is, I think, going back to 2004, that grade 4 events, which is serious disease and death, are as common as AIDS in the era of HAART. That's highly active antiretroviral therapy. So the side effects of the drugs occur with as great as or greater frequency than AIDS diseases do among the drug users, yet we don't stop and do what we do when things like Fen-Phen or Rezulin, other drugs that have been found to be remarkably dangerous and not terribly beneficial, or the benefits were outweighed by the terrible risks to people's health and safety.
Well, to be fair to the Fen-Phen scandal, the FDA knew about the problems for a long time and actively suppressed information along with the drug companies for quite some time. So there was a cover-up. It went on for quite some time, not as long as AIDS, but it was scandalous what happened. Much smaller than the AIDS scandal, of course.
I have a feeling in the world of HIV and AIDS, it's more difficult to say, well, geez, look what happens when you put these people on drugs, because they're expecting terrible things to happen to the people they put on drugs.
Well, exactly. They've told you you're going to die. So if you do, well, we were right, and it's sad and it's terrible, but we helped you the best we could.
I remember years ago there was a drug taken off the market that was a pill for intestinal disorders, and it was given to children, and several children died. In that case, it's easy to see. You're taking something for gas and you die. Risk-benefit ratio definitely doesn't pay off. But here it's confounded with all the ideas of what it means to be HIV positive and what one can expect from that. And then there's an overlap, too, between what are considered drug side effects and what are considered AIDS diseases.
Well, that's very clear here. I mean, they're talking about tuberculosis. I believe that also cryptococcal meningitis and wasting syndrome are AIDS-defining diseases. I'm not sure about acute sepsis. And some malignancies are too. So they're describing mostly AIDS diseases that occurred shortly after starting antiretroviral drugs. In an interview that I saw recently, Dr. David Raznick, who you know quite well, was talking about a syndrome called IRD, immune reconstitution disorder, or sometimes called IRIS. And that's basically AIDS-defining illnesses that start when you start drugs. And they're blamed on your immune system, not on the drugs.
Yeah, I think we talked about that in another program briefly.
Yeah. It's basically the same thing. And another thing that's being taken off the market is a doctor in Canada named Dr. Charles Smith. He was once the top forensic child pathologist in Canada, and he put a lot of people in jail, parents and other caregivers for young children, by standing up in court and claiming that they had, in one case, stabbed their little girl with scissors, in another case, raped and murdered a little girl. It was later determined through the evidence of other doctors that most of his testimony was false.
I remember in the case of the little girl supposedly being stabbed with scissors, she had been attacked by a pit bull.
That's correct. I
mean, there's a huge difference between it's just awful. I don't mean to laugh, but it's awful how people in authority can get away with making such blatantly not only just false, but bizarre statements and cause people to go to prison sometimes for the rest of their lives.
In one case, William Mullins Johnson, for example, spent 12 years in jail for supposedly raping and murdering his niece. It was later proved that his niece died of natural causes, but you can imagine being in a jail where you're considered the lowest life form, lower even than a cockroach. For 12 years, he wondered every day if this was the day that one of the other inmates was going to kill him. And he also lost many members of his family because they still refuse to talk to him. They still don't believe that he's innocent, despite the considerable amount of evidence that he is.
And an apology from this pathologist.
Yes, Charles Smith actually stood up in court and gave an apology to William Mullins Johnson. So even the pathologist himself has admitted his wrongdoing at this inquiry. Some of the things that were noted was that he wasn't properly trained. He rarely attended the death scene. He didn't get all the medical information he needed before he started the autopsy. And he was strongly protected by people above him in the system. They admired him as one of the few pathologists who wanted to do this. You can understand that a lot of doctors don't like doing autopsies on young children. It's a very emotional thing.
And there's probably not a lot of satisfaction in discovering that sometimes they just die of natural causes or inexplicable causes.
Well, or as Dr. Mohammed Al-Bayadi has found, that often they die because of the medical system. Many of these deaths occur shortly after vaccination, so they may actually be vaccination reactions that then get blamed on the parents, because when you have a serious allergic reaction to something like a vaccine, the body swells, which produces a lot of internal bruising just from that, and that can be interpreted as shaken baby syndrome. The whole syndrome is now under question because of investigations like the Goudge inquiry. People who are interested in this should go to the goudgeinquiry.ca, and Goudge is spelled Goudge.
And that's .ca for Canada.
Yeah, for Canada, and the entire report is available for download. This is a very serious report. The executive summary itself is 50 pages.
That should be at the Justice for EJ website, too, if I'm not mistaken. That's the website about the real-life situation that this television show somewhat addresses, where my 3.5-year-old daughter died suddenly and unexpectedly, and a coroner with similar problems, I would say, to that of the Canadian pathologist, falsely and maliciously claimed 4 months after her autopsy showed no obvious disease, infectious illness, no inflammation of the lung, that she had AIDS pneumonia. And that set off a police investigation and a storm of media publicity all around the world that then became, several years later, this episode on Law and Order that we'll speak about. And the website is Justice for EJ, as in ElizaJane.com.
Well, yes, I think some of there's a lot of commonalities. One of the things that they used as a slogan in Canada was "Think Dirty," and I'm not. This is not just an analogy or something. This is actually what they said. Think dirty. What does that mean?
Well, that's within the pathology or forensic pathology community. That's not everybody in the entire country,
That's
right?
true. That's the forensic
That's not part
pathologists.
of your Pledge of Allegiance.
Yes. The forensic pathologists in Canada, in Ontario, were told, think dirty. What that means is the parents or other caregivers are guilty unless there's obviously nothing that they did wrong. So they were looking to fit the symptoms to the preconception that the parents must be responsible for any unexplained death. It used to be that there were lots of cases of what they called sudden infant death syndrome, for example, unexplained deaths in the crib. There's been many theories about that, but more recently, those have been called shaken baby syndrome if there's any evidence of bruising or other things, which, as I mentioned, could be caused by an allergic reaction. The slogan, Think Dirty, reminds me of another famous slogan, Hit Hard, Hit Early. I think you know about that one, Christine.
Oh, yeah. But, David, let's get into what our program is about here.
Yes.
Which is essentially, you pointed out aptly, it's a morality tale on AIDS denialism. And in this episode of Law and Order, my personal circumstances are used to create a story about a woman who is denying her AIDS or her HIV condition, I guess you could say, and she seeks the care of a doctor who encourages this or perhaps persuades her into this. As a result, she has a daughter who is discovered to have died of AIDS pneumonia after her death only, as supposedly happened in my case. And she has an older son who's forced to be tested. And in this fictitious scenario, her doctor ends up in jail, which was the expressed wish of at least one AIDS researcher that we bring up a lot on this program.
Yes.
John Moore, who sent an email to me who said that he hoped my pediatrician would be jailed and in my place after it was found here in Los Angeles by the district attorney's office that I had done nothing, that my husband had done nothing that would constitute justification for charges of medical negligence or negligent homicide. But in this scenario, it's like AIDS Inc. has its fantasy world come true, and the guy who's sort of our doctor ends up in jail. But you mentioned something when we were talking about doing this show that's very interesting. This is a historical way to communicate allegedly important ideas to the masses through these morality tales.
Yes. According to Wikipedia, by the 15th century, these theatrical episodes called morality tales were quite common, and the idea was that you would popularize some moral message that maybe if you fool around with a neighbor's wife, you'll go to hell. And that sort of emphasized what you should or should not do to a relatively illiterate crowd. So it was a mixture of entertainment, because if it wasn't entertaining, people wouldn't come and see them, with a moral message that might be a little bit subtle so that people might receive it subliminally rather than overtly. but it was quite a powerful way to get the church's message across and to reinforce the dominance of the church in society.
Interesting, because so much of what people hold as true about HIV and AIDS is based on tremendous leaps of faith, because the science isn't there, and the view that it's necessary for everyone to adhere to these beliefs starts to fall into that category of religion. And then the fervor with which people like you and I, who are asking what I consider reasonable, normal questions about the gaps in the science and the anomalies, where, there's some pulpit-pounding sorts of, denialism. So it's interesting, this correlation with the morality tale.
Yeah, well, I'm sure we'll get into that when we talk to Robin. Do you think it's time to get him on the phone?
I think it would be great. Let's give him a call.
Okay.
So welcome to the program, Robin. Thank you for joining us on How Positive Are You?
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Good to talk to you again, Robin.
You too, David. Thanks.
So to give a more formal introduction to you for our listeners than Robin Scovill, my husband, I just want to let our listeners know that you are a filmmaker, that you attended California Institute of the Arts on a scholastic scholarship where you studied filmmaking and directing. Your first film that you completed there as a student, it's called Vergine degli Angeli, was featured at Sundance Film Festival and traveled to many festivals around the world. Your documentary film on the topic of HIV and AIDS, called The Other Side of AIDS, won a special jury prize in 2004 at the Los Angeles International AFI Film Festival. And you have another film you've made on the topic of HIV and AIDS called Questioning AIDS in South Africa. And recently, The Other Side of AIDS was purchased for broadcast by a division of MTV Television. And in addition to your work in film, you're also a screenwriter and, more recently, a real estate investor.
Yeah, that's right.
So, my interesting husband, Robin Scovill, thank you for joining us.
I appreciate it.
Is there anything that you want to tell us about you before we get into our topic of discussion today, which is the recent Law and Order episode Special Victims Unit Retro, which tackled the topic of AIDS denialism in a pretty typical manner, in which you, in the fictional portrayal of me, are eliminated. I'm always a single mom. So before we get into that, is there any thoughts you wanted to offer or further qualifications of your ability to be here and speak with us today?
Sure, yeah. Well, my training and my love has always been in storytelling, and it's been something that I've been doing since I was a kid. And that's really specifically what I studied, was narrative dramatic structure at Cal Arts. And, excuse me, I would call myself a professional storyteller. And so when you start talking about things that are omitted or, added to stories that are based on, are biographical or based on real people, it's always interesting to talk about what is going to be included, what's going to be omitted for purposes of, for purposes of structuring story, making a story work for the screen, in this case for television. So I'm not by no means a world-renowned expert on the subject, but it's certainly an area of great interest for me and of expertise, professional expertise. So I think it's an interesting topic of discussion, and we can talk about it. I'm actually sympathetic of the task of a writer to create a story, particularly something based on a real event or a real person or a real something that happened in history. And, I'm sympathetic of the idea that has to be changed for dramatic purposes. And I think in this case, omitting the husband omitting, my understanding, I haven't seen the episode, but my understanding is the episode was based loosely on you, or maybe very specifically on you, and the fact that you deny that HIV is the cause of AIDS, and that as a result of that, your daughter died. Is that right? Is that your guys' understanding of the episode?
Yeah, more or less. The story is that there's this woman, Susan, who is, due to a tragedy, a single mom of two. Her 4-year-old daughter dies and is later exhumed, and it's discovered that she died of PC pneumonia. She has a 12-year-old son who hasn't been HIV tested. Oh, by the way, I forgot, Susan's HIV positive.
Right.
And she sees a doctor, I think, in this program. His name is Gerald Hutton. It's kind of like a Peter Duesberg / Dr. Paul Fleiss character, a cross between a UC Berkeley professor who raises questions about the causal link between HIV and AIDS, and our own pediatrician. And he's a proponent of kind of a simplistic, I'd say idiotic viewpoint. AIDS doesn't exist, sort of thing.
Right.
And ultimately he's punished for not making Susan take the drugs, not making her son test, and allowing, as it were, her daughter to succumb to AIDS pneumonia. And what you said, Robin, about being sympathetic to having to add and subtract from real-life characters in order to make a story work, I understand that, but this seems to be more about making propaganda than making a story work. Because it could certainly work if one were to tell the truth about you and me and our family. But that truth is a bit difficult.
Well, I also think, too, it depends on the premise that you're coming from. If the premise of a story is, and I'll stay sort of in the realm of discussing story and why, why oftentimes liberties are taken around that, and why I support that idea. Although I want to be clear that in this particular case, I'm in a sense I'm playing devil's advocate around why a writer would change, certain facts around a story to make it work. I'm not advocating that in this case because I think it's harmful, but it really comes based on the premise. I would venture to say that the writer of this particular episode was coming from the premise of, what if a nut, somebody who was nutty thought that HIV didn't cause AIDS, which of course isn't possible. It's just a completely absurd viewpoint. Then what would happen? And then you extrapolate that out and start to explore that. But if the premise was, what if somebody who was really smart, and through experiences in her life was questioning HIV's role in AIDS, and what if, when upon closer examination, that scrutiny held up? Then that would be a very different story, and that's certainly not the agenda. I would have to assume that's not the agenda. And I think, too, we should bring up the fact that you did have a talk with the writer at some point. But
yeah, and I'm trying to get him to come on the program and tell us about his choices with regard to using me, but using a fictitious, perverted version of me, so to speak, that follows with the idea that questioning is dangerous. In this series, in this program, I die.
Yes, I was going to say that's another thing that's very different than the current circumstances. And I think all of this helps to simplify the story, because in the real story, they have to explain why your son is negative and healthy, and why your husband is negative and healthy, and why you're healthy, and also why you haven't always tested positive, but sometimes negative or indeterminate. There's a lot of complexity, and it's very much easier to essentially demonize the woman, and of course in a kind of a Victorian way to blame the woman's mistakes on a man, because behind every mistake a woman makes there's a man. I think sometimes that's the simplistic story that's told.
Well, I think too that while I'm advocating that in structuring stories, liberties have to be taken. Also when you're basing something on reality or something historic, it's not okay to be revisionist. And certainly that's the case. I mean, the omission of the Susan character not having a husband. I mean, first of all, it paints her in a light of being somebody who's had a child out of wedlock, or
No, actually, I think in this program she was married and her husband met a tragic death on an African safari. Their vehicle overturned and he was killed, and she received a transfusion and became HIV positive.
I see. Oh, I see. So
but in other primetime programs, I have been the inexplicably single mom, just out there on my own. And my view of that, my take on that, and maybe you can tell us what your perspective is, Robin, being the eliminated guy and a film writer. My perspective is that if a woman is together with a man who's intelligent and accomplished, it is far less likely that, quote, nutty things happen in their household. Where is he with regard to poor choices and so forth? But what's your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a matter, to eliminate an HIV negative husband from the equation is a choice made out of convenience. Then you don't have to answer the question, well, if he's HIV negative, then why is, how it's a conundrum,
Well, I think I would say that somebody was going to get blamed for this, quote, denialism, and they could have easily blamed the woman. They could have shown her as a single mom, doing drugs, neglecting her children. I mean, that would have been one way to do it, and then they wouldn't have needed the kind of Duisburgian character. But in this case, I think they chose to say that the woman was just maybe not very smart and was deluded by this charismatic Dr. Evil in the background. So that was probably why the portrayal of the woman was of Susan was a bit more sympathetic. It wasn't really her fault.
I think too that there's another strong choice that could be made, which is that the husband, who married this woman, but suddenly now that she's taken this position, he's then forced to leave her because obviously she's deviated from the realm of logic and what makes sense.
But if that were the case, wouldn't he, if they have two children together, do something to protect the children if he felt that her choices were endangering them? So that doesn't work either.
Yeah, well, I mean, it would be a different story at that point. Although a choice to do that would further illustrate how nutty I think you'd more effectively isolate the woman that way. But, in
maybe
this
that'll
case,
be the next TV show.
Yeah,
yes.
I'm throwing out ideas for other writers and, for bad TV shows and pop culture, premises. Next time you should pit me against Christine, further illustrating her insanity.
Right.
Don't knock him off.
Do you think...
Don't knock him off because he's HIV negative after 12 years of
Yeah, I mean, HIV negative
relations.
Husbands have rights too.
Well, maybe there could be like an evil test lab that's been telling you you're negative all this time, but you're actually positive, and that could be the thing revealed at the end, and of course then you jump out of a window or something.
Yeah, exactly.
Thank God you don't make your living in film, David. Also, too, I wanted to bring up about this episode of Law and Order Retro Special Victims Unit. Similar to other primetime portrayals of yours truly, me, the children test positive. And that's not the case in our household, is it, Robin?
No, it isn't. And again, that's another inconvenient truth. But let's talk a little bit about your conversation with the writer. I don't know his name. Josh
Kotcheff.
Right. And his dad produces the show or something?
Correct.
Little nepotiz.
Now.
Maybe. Or maybe he's extremely talented.
And it runs in the family.
Tell me what happened with regard to your conversation with him.
Well, I'm trying to get him to be on the show, which I hope he'll agree to. I called him out of the blue, from his perspective, I'm sure, introduced myself as the possible subject of his recently broadcast Law and Order episode, and asked him about the choices that were made in portraying a me that's not me, with specific regard to leaving out inconvenient facts such as I'm married and have been with a man for 12 years who persistently tests HIV negative, that our son, who is born, conceived, and raised in the same manner as our daughter, tests HIV negative, that our daughter, who is purported by the Los Angeles County Coroner's Office to have died of AIDS pneumonia, in fact, had no pneumonia whatsoever of any kind, and we are currently in a lawsuit with the Los Angeles County Coroner's Office over that malicious and purposeful decision to portray her as an AIDS victim when in fact she was not. And I asked him, with regard to all those facts, if that might not in and of itself make a more interesting and true-to-life story than the one on television, especially given that, according to a story about the creating of this episode that appeared in Planet Out, his wish was to go off of reality and tell a really compelling story. I don't know what the heck could possibly be more compelling than our real story with all the mystery and malicious acts and the medical conundrums.
When you say go off of reality, you mean deviate from or based on reality?
I think based on reality.
Okay, I gotcha.
And he told me that television would never feature an AIDS denialist. And I asked him, what is an AIDS denialist? And he kind of paused for a moment, and I said, I ask because my work is about asking questions. It's about investigation. It's not saying AIDS doesn't exist. It's asking if what we're doing around AIDS, if what we say causes it, if what we say prevents it, and how we treat it is not based on solid science, is it possible that we might be doing more harm than good in trying to address the situation and alleviate human suffering? And that was the kind of launching point for a discussion that kind of went around in circles.
Yeah.
Christine, you got his name from an AP article online, correct?
Correct.
And that article was dated just about a year and a half ago, and it described how the Centers for Disease Control came in to talk to this writer, mentioned Law and Order, and gave some vague details about the program to try to help them, as they said, be more accurate about their portrayal. But it's interesting that the Centers for Disease Control was actually involved in the fictional portrayal of a real person and turning that experience into what one might call a morality tale. If you believe what this woman believed, this is what's going to happen to you. You're going to die. Your children are going to die. Did he talk at all about the influence of the CDC?
He said that as they produce these television programs, they have an obligation to make sure they stick with the facts, and that CDC representatives help them keep the programs factual, which brought us again to the point, well, if you're trying to be factual and you're basing a show on me, why weren't you factual?
Yeah, that sounds to me like that sounds odd.
Yeah, it's a great unanswered question in this. And also, too, what I see is that so-called denialists, I'll use a term that I feel more comfortable with, AIDS rethinker or HIV skeptic, it appears as though we have influenced the granting of the Nobel Prize this year. At least one member of the Nobel Prize Committee said that the prize was granted in order to put to rest the debate and questions that we raise. We are not allowed by the AIDS mainstream to engage in direct face-to-face discussion. They won't participate. So it seems to me almost they create a fantasy world in which they deal with us the way they want to deal with us, and they win in the fantasy world. I die. My doctor's jailed. And this very closely reflects the doctor being jailed, wishes expressed by a top AIDS researcher who seems to be everywhere in the world anytime anyone is asking critical questions about the HIV/AIDS paradigm, and that's John Moore. He sent out an email that expressed the specific wish that following the death of my daughter, that I would be investigated for negligent homicide, arrested, prosecuted, and spend the rest of my life in jail, where I would no longer be a thorn in the side of the AIDS establishment. And I'm paraphrasing his remarks.
This was Bruce Moore?
No, John P. Moore.
Yeah, there's also, I thought you were referring to Mark Wainberg, who I think is his mentor. He's a somewhat older Canadian who, I think, Robin, you encountered him in one of your films.
Yeah, I interviewed him in Durban, South Africa in 2000, which was probably one of the most traumatic encounters I'd had interviewing people in film. He was quite a character.
It's quite a famous little slice of film, the end of the interview where the camera rolls on the floor or something, and you can sort of see his head somewhat slanted as he's just about literally blowing a gasket.
Yeah, it was interesting because he said turn off or put the camera aside. So I put the camera aside, and then I guess he felt like he had more, so bring the camera back on to me. I remember I kind of kept the camera running in the elevator on the way down, and the discussion continued, and I lifted the camera back up, and I remember him running and hiding behind a pillar. It was pretty interesting.
Well, that sort of reinforces what Christine was saying, is that these dialogues, these confrontations go on in a virtual world where they have input and we do not.
Well, they would have to, wouldn't they?
Yeah, they tell stories in a way, in forums in which they can't be challenged. This is a fictional story, but Wainberg portrayed it as fact to an international corps of journalists last summer, last July. He told a story about a completely fictitious doctor appointment I allegedly took our daughter on, in which our unnamed pediatrician said, "Your daughter is sick. She should be on AIDS meds. I order that she be HIV tested immediately," in his made-up scenario.
Yeah.
And I, in his made-up scenario, say, "No, HIV is a kind of virus that does not cause AIDS. I refuse to test her." He made up this scenario. It is well known in the media that went all over the world that no doctor ever said, "Your daughter is sick and needs to be tested." No doctor ever ordered medication for her apart from an antibiotic for an ear infection. It never happened. But there he is creating this fantasy situation to meet the needs of the propaganda. You can only call it that at this point, when it's dishonest and purposefully so, in order to promote a point of view that isn't substantiated by the true story that would be told if the facts were laid out. I don't know any word for it except propaganda. And again, they create this world in which there's no possible confrontation because we're not there.
Yeah, although, again, and I can certainly see your point of view, and I share it to some degree, but this is not the Christine Maggiore story that he's making. I mean, I can understand.
Oh, he said it was me.
Well, I mean, it's actually Susan on an episode of Law and Order.
No, I'm talking about Wainberg. This is what Wainberg said as if it were me. He said Christine Maggiore.
Okay, I understand. I understand what you're saying. Yeah, of course. That I get it. But I'm just going back to the idea of what the writer. I'm sorry. What's his first name again?
Josh.
Josh. What Josh was doing was writing a fictional story on a television show, and he based that character loosely on you. And yes, it sounds like he has an agenda, and he wants people to know that AIDS denialists are bad and all that stuff. But there is license, because he's not making the Christine Maggiore story. He's making an episode of Law and Order, and so
I would say that it's more than that because the reason he's making the Susan story and not a fictionalized story closer to the truth is because he feels that he wants to help public health. And he wants to help public health by portraying the so-called facts as the CDC wants them to be portrayed.
Yeah, and I also think he wants to have a career as a writer. He wants to make money writing, and he wants to sell projects. And so, he has an idea of what he thinks will sell. And so, I think that's what's driving it too. I'm not sure that, again, it may be that he's really his foremost agenda is to push an agenda, but it's possible too that he's not sitting back there twisting his mustache, to figure out how to lie to the masses or misportray Christine. I think he probably has look, the guy got an episode on television. That's not easy to do, and it was from 2 years ago, and it just takes it's Herculean, the effort to write these episodes and get them made, and I just think that he probably has a pretty clear idea of what will and what won't make cut mustard,
Well, I guess that's what it is. There may be two possible feelings. One is that I genuinely want to help public health, and so I'm going to trust that the CDC is going to tell me how to do that. And so that makes me feel like these episodes are factual. And the second is that he's a realist. And it's well, I don't know if the CDC is right or not, but it's not going to be good for my career to portray something that's directly opposed to their interests because they have a very powerful impact on Hollywood. One of the things this article talked about was how the CDC has set up an organization that is intended to influence the portrayal of medical issues on television.
The mass media, yeah.
Yeah. I just want to interject something here. This is a quote from Josh Kotcheff in the article on Planet Out about the creation of this Law & Order episode. He says, quote, "There are people who do believe these kinds of myths, and it can have an impact on their lives. If they don't take HIV fighting medications, they're going to die."
Yeah, okay.
So
okay.
We're trying to be nice here, but the fact of the matter is that's what he says. There are people who believe these myths. They're dangerous. It's terrible. It can impact their lives. If they don't take their drugs, they're going to die. Well, that's not quite true. You're doing a story about somebody who doesn't take the drugs and doesn't die. So they change it.
Yeah.
I think it's really unfair to people who have lived many years without the drugs, who are healthy, who feel that they're not allowed to have a voice.
Well, according to Josh, they'll never be given one because we cannot have that message on television.
Well,
it's very clear.
Not only that, they can't even try to raise their voice because a young person, especially a young heterosexual man, who says that he's HIV positive is then in danger of criminal charges for any previous relationships that person might have had. And so they have to keep quiet. So in many cases, even if they were offered a show on television, they would have to keep their mouths shut.
Yeah, hearing that quote from Josh, it makes me think it's kind of lame.
What do you mean by lame?
Well, he's clearly, it's not about creating art at that point. It's about trying to get out a message, that's a misinformed message.
And also, here's a quote from another writer on the show, Paul Graylong, and I'm going to try to get him on How Positive Are You? He says, quote, it reflects that the hard work we put into accurate portrayal of health issues that affect Americans. This is a quote in which they're talking about how the CDC participates and guides them when they're creating these shows. But, that accurate and health issues, certainly my experiences would constitute a health issue, a timely and interesting health issue, and accurately giving that airtime, according to Josh, is not possible because in the story they want to tell, people like me are a danger to the party line. And I think that's what this all boils down to. And the article is called HIV on TV, A Fight for Realism.
Well, that's another thing that you brought up earlier is the word facts. And I think that just like isolation or purification, the word has been debased maybe irredeemably. I was just looking at a paper in the journal AIDS today that has a statement that 3-drug antiretroviral therapy minimizes total adverse events, which sounds like the drugs are good in this context. But then they say this is defined as the sum of HIV infections, or whatever passes for HIV infections, and mitochondrial toxicity. The reality was in this study that mitochondrial toxicity was 10 times higher amongst children whose mothers had been exposed to AIDS drugs. But the rate of HIV positivity was lower. And since mitochondrial toxicity is relatively rare, HIV positivity overwhelmed numerically the mitochondrial toxicity cases. So they can create this fact that adverse events are decreased by the drugs, when in actual fact, in measurable adverse effects that have a noticeable health impact, they went up by a factor of 10.
And they're caused by the drugs.
They're caused by the drugs, and that's not surprising based on these drugs. But my point is that this is the creation of a fact because they want to believe that the drugs are good, so they can continue to manipulate the numbers until they get something to come out which they can repackage as something that sounds really good, like total adverse events. But when you actually examine what's an adverse event, is having certain DNA or RNA in a child's body an adverse event when it's had no clinical consequences? This concept of fact just becomes propaganda.
So at the same time that fact erodes into fiction in medical journals, we have fiction eroding into worse fiction on primetime television with regard to this same issue.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well,
concerning.
it's been a great discussion of this. It's certainly made me look at this episode a little bit differently, and I appreciate you playing devil's advocate for a little while, at least. Robin?
Yeah, I should also apologize for implying nepotism. I don't know Josh at all, and I don't know the relationship he has, and that was kind of an unfair shot. Really born out of, I don't like people who don't know my wife portraying my wife in a ill light that's completely misinformed. It's hurtful and it's weird and it's also an injustice. So, but that still doesn't give me the right to imply nepotism, because I'm sure that he's like a really amazing writer and would probably have a career without his dad.
Oh, thanks for saying that, Rob. That's mighty big of you for a guy who offed your wife.
Hey, thanks for having me on, you guys.
Sure, you got to get back to work?
Yeah, I got to go write another story.
Okay. Good luck.
Hey, thanks a lot.
Stick to the facts.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly, always.
Okay.
It is interesting. I just want to point out someone I consider a mentor is Robert McKee, who wrote the book Story. He signed my book several years ago that said, "To Robin, write the truth." Robert McKee. It's a great beacon.
Yes.
Whatever the truth is.
Well, yeah, truth in fiction is kind of hard to get your head around, but I think sometimes fiction is distinctly not truthful.
Well, yeah, fiction that doesn't work, I think, is not truthful.
Yeah.
Excellent. Hey, thanks for doing the show, you guys. I think it's really cool, and it's fun to be a part of it. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Robin. Since our originally scheduled guest for this episode, Dr. Jocelyn D., an AIDS doctor at the Rand Schrader Clinic in Los Angeles, rescheduled her interview with us for a later date, we decided to include Dr. Michael Ellner, a hypnosis educator from New York City, in our discussions about the Law and Order episode on so-called AIDS denialism. Let's give him a call now.
So welcome to the show, Michael Ellner. Thanks for joining us.
It's my pleasure to join you. Hello,
Hi, Michael.
And for our listeners, I just want to mention that you are the Hypnosis Educator of the Year for 2008, as awarded by the prestigious International Medical and Dental Hypnotherapy Association. And with that in mind, I'm wondering, Michael, if you could tell us a little bit about what it is that you do in addition to being president of Health Education AIDS Liaison in New York.
Well, I am a medical hypnotist, and I train doctors, dentists, psychologists, nurses, and therapists of all persuasions in using hypnotic techniques for the relief of pain and anxiety. And in my private practice, I help people with a wide range of everyday problems that can be relieved with hypnosis. Mostly it's dehypnotizing people. They come in and their problem is a result of unrecognized self-hypnosis or auto-hypnosis, and I help them perceive things in healthier ways.
And this factors in, too, with how you help people diagnosed HIV positive or with AIDS in alleviating that problem that exists where if you have negative expectations, if you believe you're going to die, it's highly likely that you will have physical problems that follow that belief.
That's very true, Christine. In the early 80s, when I first started hearing about AIDS, my concern as an expert in hypnosis was that people were actually being programmed to get sick and die by the way the media was describing AIDS and beating the hysteria, always fatal, always fatal, always fatal, always fatal. I quickly discovered that wasn't true. That was a means of getting public sympathy. It was a means of getting public attention. It was a means of raising lots and lots of money. And I was concerned about the consequences of somebody getting a diagnosis and believing that it was always fatal. And my feeling was is you might as well shoot him. It would be kinder. And on top of that, I was watching what happened when people made very desperate treatment choices, and it appeared to me, not as a medical expert, but just as someone paying close attention, that these people, in effect, were being medically murdered. That during the hysteria, perhaps the most dangerous thing was seeing a medical doctor who treated people with AIDS. And this certainly was proved in the late 80s with high-dose AZT. Tens of thousands of these gay men who trusted their doctors and trusted their scientists took these horrific treatments, and I believe the consequence was it murdered.
And do you think there was something special going on with gay men, that perhaps they'd internalized their sort of society's antipathy towards them, and that was sort of triggered by the whole HIV/AIDS diagnosis?
I do. I'm not a psychologist, and I am not a social scientist, but it seems that many people recognize that AIDS gave a whole different life to the gay rights movement. And it was almost as if suddenly you were invited to the table, but you had to get sick and die. And I believe that there was the illusion of tolerance and acceptance that kind of came under the AIDS umbrella. And I think that there was a hope that it would normalize homosexuality. Obviously, it didn't. You know, all these years later, more than 25 years later, and you just see that people have voted against gay marriage and a law was reversed. So these prejudices and these hostilities still exist. But I think a lot of people joined the system with the hope that AIDS was going to make things different.
Turning our discussion to what this podcast episode is about, that is the Law and Order episode called Retro, in which AIDS denialists, as they're called, which I think there's something even hypnotic in that name that's foisted upon anyone who's thinking skeptically or critically about this issue. But turning our attention to that, I wonder if you could speak to how the media is used in this same way of communicating. You know, when you said, that the AIDS diagnosis is fatal was constantly being repeated in the media, that was the news, where people recognize, I'm picking up a newspaper, I expect to be reading something factual. But when people sit down in front of an entertaining television show that is supposedly made up, but they're getting insidious public service announcements through the plot line, that almost seems like a form of hypnosis. And I wondered if you could comment on that in a general nature and more specific to what we saw in this Law and Order episode.
I can. And first, I would want anyone listening to this to understand that TV and movies are the most powerful hypnotic devices ever invented. When a person is watching television for entertainment, they must, in order to enjoy it, suspend disbelief. And you can say that hypnosis is a state where the person suspends disbelief and becomes more suggestible.
They actually turn off their critical thought process in order to accept the hypnotic suggestion. Is that not more or less?
In order to be entertained by the program. Imagine you're watching an adventure show or an action show or a love show, and your inner skeptic, your inner critic is evaluating everything going on. Oh, that's special effects. Oh, that's an actress. Oh, that's an actor. You would never be engaged by the storyline.
Would it be fair to say that they're not suspending disbelief, but they're actually activating belief? Because
yes.
My feeling is that when you're watching a good movie, I don't watch television a whole lot, but you really believe that it's true for those moments that you're there. And if it was to suddenly stop, there's kind of a shock, like waking from a dream, where you have to realize this reality is not true. But it really is a very powerful belief while you're involved.
Yes, by suspending belief, you automatically expand your ability to believe whatever it is you're participating in. And it becomes very, very dangerous because you then don't wonder about the motivation of the people communicating to you. It appears to be entertainment. But if you step back, one has to wonder, are the writers of the show medical experts? And in my experience, you want to put on your BS detectors anytime you see or hear that something's based on an actual event. And in this case, that creates the impression that everything that you see here happened. Everything you've seen here reflects a reality. And in fact, in this episode, it's manufactured, and it's manufactured to create a mindset. It's manufactured to reinforce beliefs that have already been put out there. And not only is it disturbing in the sense that this happened to a real family and that there's nothing I can imagine more painful than losing a child, and then you add upon it being exploited by the system, being exploited by the medical examiner, being exploited by the LA Times, and now being exploited by this TV show, Law and Order. It's really, to me, quite disturbing just as a citizen and as a person capable of understanding the gross manipulation that's taking place.
What's interesting to me, too, about this episode that is supposedly used to convey correct they claim ideas about HIV and AIDS, that is, if you don't follow the rules and take the drugs, you will die, is that they've chosen to portray someone who doesn't follow the rules and is fine, so they make me die in the episode. I am on a witness stand being cross-examined about the death of my daughter, and this thing, my daughter's 4 instead of 3, but clearly it's me. And this me character is stammering to explain how she tried to give her child the best medical care possible and suddenly starts convulsing and falls on the courtroom floor. And then the next scene, she's dead. And some man steps out of the shadows and says she died of AIDS. And another one steps out of the shadows and says her brain was eaten away by toxoplasmosis. It was like Swiss cheese. I mean, what is that? When put it, first of all, it's not true. And second of all, when that's put in that format of a entertaining television show in which people have suspended their critical thought, what the heck does that do?
Well, what it does is it prevents anyone from actually thinking about any of the information. In fact, if anyone is paying attention, perhaps the most dangerous thing throughout the history of AIDS was the medical treatments that were offered to people and the basic misrepresentations. As you both know, there is no proof anywhere that anyone on the planet is infected with an HIV. These tests are completely bankrupt. They prove nothing. So the whole basis that that someone's infected and didn't follow medical advice is based on a gross misrepresentation. There is no proof anywhere on the planet that anyone's infected.
One thought I've had is that if a fictional show like Law and Order is a good imitation of reality in that the people are acting like they're real employees of law enforcement agencies, etc., real prosecutors. Is it possible that a year later, people remembering the show might actually think that it was reality? Is it possible that these television shows create a false memory in people?
Not only is it possible, David, I believe it's very likely, and I believe that's part of the intention. Memory is a very strange thing, and it's very easy to manipulate. And when a person has a false memory, very often they defend them more vigorously, and they seem more real than actual memories.
And what would happen if one of these people was on a jury? And let's say that this was a trial, as there have been trials, of a woman who insisted on breastfeeding her child or refused to give AZT to the child.
I could guarantee you that that person would not get a fair trial because everybody's mind would be made up in advance before they even listen to the evidence. And that's the danger of being hypnotized, is that there would be no possibility for actually hearing the case. They would have decided the case in advance. Everybody knows that the doctor knows best. Look, this child was killed because the parents were irresponsible. And I know in this situation, the parents, in fact, the last contact I had with EJ was with you, David. We went to Christine and Robin's home for dinner. We were both visiting California at the same time.
Yes, it's a very fond memory.
And here we were together with a very healthy, dynamic child, and I remember thinking how it reflected a happy home, how it reflected responsible, caring parents. I remember thinking that if it wasn't for this dark cloud of what HIV does to people, that it would be a normal household, a healthy household. Let me correct that.
Yeah, it reminded me of my kids who were a little old, maybe almost a decade older, and thinking that, boy, I'm not sure I could keep up with kids like this anymore. As kids get older, they get a bit more independent, and they're not quite so demanding on your time and energy. But kids of that age are incredibly demanding of their parents, and these were two very lively kids.
And I have a little reservation talking about it because I don't want to cause any pain for Christine. But I'm aware that the tragedy is compounded because the death is probably the only time she did follow medical advice and gave her daughter the antibiotics that are probably the cause of death. And to be abused that way, I'm not a violent person, and I would never promote violence, but I think if I was in that situation, I might consider buying a gun. I just don't know how people could be abused more viciously than what happened in this case. And you're in my prayers every day, Christine.
Oh, thank you, Michael. You get me all choked up here. And I appreciate you guys talking about my family. It's funny, too, well, it's not funny, actually. In trauma, sometimes you forget. There's that other aspect of memory, what you talked about, Michael. Memory's a funny thing, and I have trouble sometimes even remembering those moments with my family. It's like the trauma just kind of shocked it out of me. So it's nice to hear you talking about that dinner we had, because I had completely forgotten about that. So thank you. And on another comment I wanted to make with regard to the power of this teleplay, I didn't realize how upset it would make me. I was watching the clips with my husband, and we were laughing about how they always make him disappear because you couldn't have him fit into this scenario and have it work, and what my hair looks like in this incarnation, this primetime incarnation of me. And I walked away, and within about, I'd say 5 or 6 hours, I developed a rash all over my chest. And when I showed my husband, he came home, he said, "You've let it get to you. You've let that portrayal of you as somebody whose brain has been eaten away by toxoplasmosis and, died of AIDS get to you."
Actually, I would think that it's more evidence that your natural defenses are working, and that's how your body gets rid of all that toxicity. The rash is a natural way for a body to get rid of those toxic chemicals that resulted from the experience of seeing that. So in a way, it shows that your natural defenses are working, and then the body goes back to being in normal balance.
Have you seen cases, Michael, where stress alone has induced illness? With HIV, there's always the question, people are going to say, well...
Anyone who doubts that can put in psychodermatology into their browsers, and what they will find is there's an emerging field of scientists who are discovering that the skin is one of the most sensitive organs in terms of stress, and that there are a wide range of immediate reactions: hives, rashes, psoriasis, eczema. All of these things.
Shingles, too.
Shingles, absolutely, are expressions of our nervous system and our defenses, our immune system, to stress. And the way I found out about the episode, Christine, just so you know, is I started getting phone calls and emails. And everyone assumed that everyone saw it. And the people who saw it recognized you, and the people who saw it were outraged and disturbed and confused, because here the medical examiner said, HIV has been isolated. I'd like to see some proof of that. I've been searching for that proof since 1984.
Now,
I have not found it.
You're referring to the real-life supposed news show with the medical examiner that was on primetime, or the Law & Order episode?
I was told in various emails and things that there was a statement made about the denialism and reinforcing the idea, of course, HIV was isolated.
I see. Yeah, I've only seen the clips of the show, so I missed that. But that's interesting because it closely parallels what the medical examiner in real life on a supposed news show claimed, that in our daughter's case, he showed a visual image of some black spots and said, "This is the AIDS virus in the middle of this girl's brain," which was not. It was not an isolate of anything, and it just... There's very little distinction between an entertaining TV show and what's supposed to be news in this regard. It's all one big blur.
Well,
I can see how people could get confused. I'm confused at this
yeah,
point.
well, Michael, on this show we're also talking about the Goudge inquiry in Canada, which is a case where a pathologist was creating fantasy in the courtroom, which resulted in the false conviction of quite a few Canadians, mostly parents or other caregivers like uncles or babysitters, false convictions based on his perception that these were evil people. And it was apparently founded in some strange religious beliefs that this pathologist had. But it's an illustration of how, fiction occurs in supposedly factual arenas, and at the same time, television is claiming that they're providing factual information in a fictional, entertaining television show.
So we can agree that when you're watching a show and you suspend disbelief, and that means you activate your belief, and you're told something, that can have a very, very deleterious effect. I'll give you an example that happened in our recent history. Tens of thousands of families were destroyed by licensed therapists who believed that obesity or certain psychological problems indicated that a person had some sexual abuse somewhere in their history. And tens of thousands of families were destroyed because they planted these memories. And then these people sued their parents, accused their parents of sexual exploitation and abuse, and nothing could ever be demonstrated that these things actually happened because they were false memories. They were based on the belief of the therapist. If you have this problem, you must have sexual abuse in your history. So they implanted it.
And if you don't remember it, we'll help you remember it.
Exactly.
And that just goes to show if you can't remember it, then it must have been really traumatic because you've buried it so deep.
And that was the Freudian concept, of course, all the hidden demons within us. Of course, modern psychology has abandoned that. They just haven't formally announced it. All of these analytical approaches have been replaced by cognitive approaches. So that whole belief system is from another paradigm and really is quite dangerous in terms of looking at how dangerous it is when we invest our trust in experts. And, according to, when you talked about the media, in the beginning of the crisis, the media, not only news shows, but entertainment played a huge role in creating the impression everybody's at risk, everybody's at risk, everybody's at risk. And really what that did was make it much more likely that the people who were truly at risk would get sick and die, because no one paid attention to the actual risks of developing age-related problems. They masked them. This homogenizing, everyone can get it, focused tension away from what really was causing people to get ill. And we knew from the beginning what the risks were.
Can something like hypnosis or messages actually in the end have the opposite effect? Like, I think I sense amongst society there's kind of a numbness towards AIDS where, people may have a lot of messages buried subliminally, but the impact of talking about AIDS seems to be much less. Do you see something like that? Do you agree with that assessment?
I agree with it, but what I noticed, David, is that there are mechanisms in place that are looking to regenerate hysteria on an annual basis. We have International AIDS Day, World AIDS Day. We have all of these, Latin AIDS Day. We have all of these things that constantly occur. Every 6 or 7 months, there's something. Someone's going to the churches and warning them that the danger is women of color are at the greatest risk, and Asians are dying, so that there is a desperate kind of maintenance taking place. But you're right, there is a certain fatigue. You can only fool the people some of the time. I would imagine that more and more more heterosexuals are not afraid of contracting AIDS, that if you look at that group, condom sales are going down dramatically because it's really hard to convince people they're at risk when no one they know who doesn't have the well-known health risks is getting AIDS. The average person I talk to actually doesn't know anyone personally who has AIDS. It's very, very restricted to subcultures within certain minority populations.
With regard to that, Michael, I wanted to ask you a question, because what I see, too, is what you and David are talking about with regard to there's not that many people know and can point to, and that there is a certain complacency or burnout. And I wonder what happens when people are confronted with this constant message from the media. This is a problem. This is a problem. It's a terrible problem. And I would propose that it occurs with greater frequency than what you suggested on the annual and monthly basis. It's almost every day in the newspaper. There's some way of just keeping HIV and AIDS in the media on a nearly daily basis, I notice. And even in journalistic seminars where they're training people to report on this stuff, they emphasize the importance of awareness. But what happens when there's this message that conflicts with your present reality? Which way does the mind tend to go?
Usually it goes the way it was pre-programmed. We're pre-programmed not to make waves. We're pre-programmed
some of us are.
Well, what I'm talking about as a society, there are always exceptions. And the reason we all know each other is because we tend to question authority. And that's not a bad thing. That's a very important thing to do. And what I see is you're right. They are attempting to maintain a daily kind of thing, but what I notice is that there are these big thrusts, these larger attempts that I view as annually. But I do notice some very alarming trends. They are really gearing up around the world to criminalize sexual activity if someone is positive. There is not evidence anywhere on the planet that one person has affected another because there's no evidence that one person is actually infected. But one has to wonder, with all this programming, 25 years, 28 years of hearing this stuff, what will happen to people who are now set up in front of us as criminals? You've seen that in Canada. It's happening in Africa. It's happening in Asia. It wouldn't surprise me if it's happening in America.
Oh, it is. I mean, there's fairly routine examples of criminal charges against HIV-positive people, mostly heterosexual men for some strange reasons, but it's quite common in the U.S., although it doesn't get nearly as much attention as in Canada, which recently had the first case of a man being charged with first-degree murder because 2 or 3 of his lovers died of what's a recognized side effect of AZT.
You know, one of the things about this is what I noticed right away, just as an outsider, is that all the people getting sick had the same health risks. And that seemed to me to be very, very much a red flag. You know, we have these euphemisms so that when you say drug users are their partners, well, in my experience, the partners of drug users are more likely to be drug users themselves than the general population. And that the people involved in taking the medications, well, it's across the board. If you're taking these medications, you're in the same risk group. And what I noticed early on in terms of the gay community, which is something that you can't speak about, no one ever talks about, was it seemed to be primarily a disease that was developing in people who were anal receptive. I saw many, many, many couples in our meetings, hundreds and eventually thousands, where the people who were the insertive sexual partner weren't getting sick. And I discovered they use different drugs. They have different behaviors.
When you say different drugs, you're referring to recreational drugs?
Yes. Or? You know, for example, the most popular recreational drug for bottoms tended to be the nitrite aphrodisiacs, the nitrite inhalants.
The poppers.
Poppers. And these weren't used by the insertive partners because it made you impotent.
It's right. If it's relaxing the muscles in the anal receptive area, it would be relaxing other muscles as well.
Yes.
When you don't want them to be relaxed, right?
So then you began to see that the people developing Kaposi sarcoma were the people using these nitrites. It seemed to me to make a lot of sense to suspect it was involved.
And there was actually quite a bit of science for that, which ended abruptly with Gallo's announcement.
Yes. Another thing is that one of the early members of HEAL and our science advisor, Frank Benakis, was very, very active in 12-step programs and had been drug-free and alcohol-free for many years. He was a mathematician. He started keeping a list of everyone who died of AIDS that he knew. And he knew their health risks because these people would come in meetings and reveal it in this confidential setting. And every one of these people had previous liver disease. Every one of these people had many, many, many years of alcohol and drug use because they were multi-substance abusers. And I would think that they ignore this with the claim previous healthy people get infected and get ill. I have never met a previous healthy person unless you were unlucky enough to take the test positive, have none of the risks, and then become part of the major risk group, which is taking AIDS treatment, taking anti-HIV drugs. I consider that the major group.
I would put forth that another risk group is those who believe and take to heart the diagnosis and never from that day forward feel that they're normal, that they have the possibilities for the future that other, quote, normal people have. And this is only exacerbated by the tighter and tighter reins that are put around what a person can and cannot do once they test positive with regard to things like the criminalization of sexual expression and so forth.
I think it would be very naive not to be aware and include the awful stigma of testing positive to a person's declining health. They are related dramatically. And in the beginning of the crisis, what one saw is that it was outing homosexuals. They couldn't tell their parents they were Haitian. They couldn't tell their parents they were hemophiliacs. And their parents didn't necessarily want to believe that they were heroin addicts. And one of the big disturbing things in the gay community was that people would begin to suspect you're homosexual whether you were ready to tell them or not. And we lived in a very anti-homosexual time then.
Well, yes, I know a man from this area who works in kind of a blue-collar profession, and his assumption is that if his coworkers were to find out that he was HIV positive, they would consider him to be gay, and that would erupt double prejudice, both the prejudice that they think he could infect them and kill them, and secondly, that he was homosexual, which they might be very prejudiced against. So consequently, he's got to keep this a very, very quiet secret. And it's difficult to keep a secret like that from people you work with every day. You may go out and have a few drinks. Your boundaries are down. But if you're HIV positive in this society, I mean, unless you're amongst a group where there are many such people, you have to keep it extremely quiet.
David, I believe that when a person believes that they must keep a secret, it puts them in chronic stress states. And these chronic stress states produce chemical reactions in our body that interfere with maintaining balance and health. That people heal and people balance themselves in rest and digest states. It's impossible to enter these states if you have a frightening secret that you're afraid can be uncovered at any time. And when a person is in these chronic stress states, it lowers their defenses, and it makes them susceptible to a wide range of illness. And this is a well-known fact in immunology. Chronic stress is one of the major causes of disease, and people with HIV that I meet, even the most enlightened will say, when I got my diagnosis, I felt dirty. When I got my diagnosis, I experienced intense shame. When I got my diagnosis, these issues were bigger than my fear of dying. And that's quite amazing. I mean, the initial thing is you think everyone is afraid of dying. Everyone was being afraid that I met of being categorized in this group. And that's kind of amazing when you stop and think about it, that the fear of being exposed was greater than the fear of being killed. And that's what we heard at HEAL meetings. I didn't plan on dedicating 28 years of my life in this area. I saw a need in the early crisis, and as time went on, the need continued to grow. Thankfully, Christine came along and picked up a lot of the load. You came along and picked up the load, and now there are thousands of activists around the world. In the beginning of the crisis, I was kind of alone. We had a bunch of friends in New York City who tried to deal with this monster.
Speaking of the early days and the way things have changed through organizations like Rethinking AIDS, Alberta Reappraising AIDS Society, Alive and Well, I wonder, Michael, if we've got to wrap things up a bit here. I wonder if you can make a comment about just the idea that this questioning perspective, or in the pejorative term denialism, poses such a threat that it's something that needs to be addressed on mainstream primetime television programs. Do you have any thoughts?
Yes, I do. You see, I think that's the way they isolate and marginalize any threat to the status quo. And I think denialism is sort of an offshoot of the generalized conspiracy theorist. No matter how important the cause is, if you're labeled a conspiracy theorist, no one takes you seriously. If you're labeled a denialist, no one takes you seriously. The whole basis of science is about debate. The whole basis of science is about the presentation of evidence. And here you have a situation where the president of South Africa was criticized because he put together a panel of scientists to try to make sense of what was going on in Africa, which was obviously different than what was going on at the West. You'd have to be a moron not to see the huge differences. And here this president was silenced. And he was silenced by the media.
Yes, and although, when he was finally evicted from his job as president, it had nothing to do with his viewpoints on AIDS, so one can only assume that the resistance to hypnosis is maybe greater in South Africa than elsewhere.
I would think it's because they're closer to a sense of freedom. If you take a look at an average person's life, during your childhood, there's a freedom. There's the ability to play. There's the ability to explore. And that's beaten out of you during your education. And the message always is, do what you're told, conform. Experts know best. And people usually feel a certain anxiety when they question something. I think what's happened in what is called Rethinking AIDS, and that movement is the only thing that snaps you out of those situations is the desperation that people find them in. Stress can put you into a profound trance, and it could release all your prior conditioning. When Pavlov created numerous animals that he conditioned, he had a flood in his basement. And some of the animals died in the flood, but the surviving animals, all well-conditioned prior to the flood, were automatically deconditioned as a result of the stress of the flood. And I think a lot of people who are thrust in this situation find themselves escaping from a lot of trances that allow them to question. But other people, the minute they question, they experience social isolation, so they conform. If you question anything to do about AIDS, in addition to being HIV positive, you become socially isolated for questioning. You become socially isolated for being a denialist. And I think isolation can kill. I think isolation can kill as effectively as any virus that's claimed to kill people. And I've never seen, in my lifetime, I'm going to be 60 years old, I've never seen anything like the social isolation of people who are told they're HIV positive. It could give you nightmares.
Yeah.
It's interesting, too, what you bring up here, Michael, because on our next episode, we actually have someone who, it seemed, snapped out of their trance around HIV and AIDS in a very profound and beautiful and impactful way. She was working as a social worker for people who were diagnosed positive and with AIDS in an organization that was all about AIDS, saw the documentary film The Other Side of AIDS, and I guess it was, as you put it, traumatic enough that she snapped out of that and couldn't go back into that world, and then experienced what you call the isolation that comes from being a questioner. So it's very interesting and a great lead into our next episode.
Certainly that happened with Dr. Kosher, a suspected scientist 1 minute, and then based on being a scientist and following her conscience, she suddenly found herself not welcome in the community.
Well, yeah, and I hope this discussion that we've had helps perhaps some of our listeners, because we have a variety of people who are committed rethinkers and those who are just encountering this discussion for the first time.
I just want to say something as somebody who's followed this from the beginning. There was a point in time where Christine Maggiore tested positive, questioned her positivity, and then became an activist. And in my opinion, what if everything you thought you knew about AIDS was wrong deserves a Pulitzer Prize? I think it's one of the most important publications ever made, and I have personally distributed to a number of people who snapped out of their trance because of this powerful and beautifully written book. I think it's one of the most important books on the planet. And if you haven't read it, do yourself a favor and check it out. And I get no commission or no benefit from recommending it. I just think it's one of the most important books ever written. If you're going to give yourself a Christmas present, read this book.
Thanks, Michael. That's really nice. Thank you.
You're welcome. I love you, Christine, and I think the world of you, and I'm sorry that you're being treated this way.
Thanks, Michael. You get me all choked up again.
Yes. Thank you so much for being on our podcast today.
Thank you for having me. Bye.
Goodbye.
Bye, and we'll talk to you soon.
Okay, question authority.
Certainly.
That's what we do here. Well, that was an interesting discussion with Robin and with Michael Ellner.
It certainly was.
Yeah, I look forward to our next episode with Sarah Breidenbach, who is the former AIDS social worker that I referred to in our conversation with Michael Ellner. I also want to mention, for those who expected to hear from Dr. Jocelyn D., as originally indicated in the beginning of our program, that she has twice had to postpone her conversation with us at How Positive Are You? She's rescheduled for another time, and we hope to go over these same issues of denialism in the media and her role as a medical advisor to this television program Law and Order and other programs that address issues of HIV and AIDS.
I think it's very important to have people on the show who don't have the same viewpoints as us. We want to be able to present some of our concerns to them and hear their thoughts as well, and have a respectful, if somewhat perhaps slightly combative discussion. So I really look forward to having her on in the future.
Yeah, and I think as listeners will notice, no one is edited. That can sometimes be a bad thing, as certain guests go into greater detail than we might want or need, but we certainly don't edit anyone's remarks to portray them in any particular way. So someone who doesn't necessarily agree with the idea that this issue is open for questioning and careful critique and investigation should feel comfortable being on this program.
Yeah, that's very true. I have a personal commitment, and we together have a commitment to have an accurate recording of the discussions, and so the only editing is perhaps if somebody breaks into a fit of coughing and we have to stop taping and restart, that might get edited out, but assuming that the coughing doesn't convey any information, that would be the extent of it.
Yeah. So I guess we're at the end of another episode. Thank you for listening, and we hope you'll tune in again for How Positive Are You?
Yes, thanks so much for listening. Don't forget to tell all your friends about this, and if this is the first one you're listening to, go to our archives and listen to the whole set. I'm sure you'll find them all interesting.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.